Hello and welcome everybody. My name is Steph. I'm Cochrane's Research Integrity Editor, and I'm going to be leading to this webinar today on Cochrane's conflict of interest policies and process, and especially what's new. So fitting with our topic, here's my own declaration of interest. I'm employed as Research Integrity Editor by Cochrane UK, and I also occasionally teach on research ethics at the moment at Vienna Medical University and at other public institutions. So here's a little overview of what we're going to cover today. So I'm going to give an overview of Cochrane's COI policies. We have two of them. And then we're going to talk a little bit about why we have these policies and why we have these processes. What we're going to be covering is what is a conflict of interest, what kinds of conflicts exist, why does conflict of interest matter, especially when it comes to trust in science, how conflicts of interest specifically affect systematic reviews, how academic careers and the current funding situation can affect conflicts of interest, and how conflicts are managed in general and specifically at Cochrane. Then we're going to talk about Cochrane's two COI policies. First, about Cochrane policy for library content that affects our authors, editors, and peer reviewers. And that has, both our policies have had a recent update in 2025. We're going to go into a few details of that. We're also going to talk about our new declarations of interest process, which is maybe the biggest change that we have made. And then we're going to look at the COI policy for Cochrane staff and groups. So here's an overview of our two policies. One is our COI policy for Cochrane library content that, as I just said, is for authors, editors, peer reviewers, and really anyone involved in producing content for the Cochrane library. Now, Cochrane has had such a policy since 2004, and it was revised in 2014. And this 2014 commercial sponsorship policy was then superseded in 2020 by our current policy, but it is still in effect for protocols that were started before October 14th, 2020, which is the date when our 2020 policy came into effect. Now, this policy will be retired on October 1st this year, and I'm going to say a little more about that later in the webinar. The other is Cochrane's COI policy for groups and staff, and that covers our staff, members of Cochrane groups or unit, our governing board, the editorial board, and any other Cochrane staff or affiliate categories. This policy has existed since 2014 as well. Both of these have recently been updated. You may have seen that on Cochrane's news site, and we will talk about these updates later. But first, let's look at conflict of interest on a slightly more general level. Now, why should we care about conflict of interest? First of all, what is a conflict of interest? We at Cochrane use this definition. A conflict of interest is defined as a set of conditions that pose a risk. That pose a risk that professional judgment concerning a primary interest, such as the validity of research, can be unduly influenced by a secondary interest, such as financial gain. So as you can see, the conflict part here arises out of the fact that researchers can have different interests that may come into competition with one another. And this poses a risk since the primary interest of research to produce reliable and trustworthy data can be distorted by the influence of secondary interest, such as financial gain, but not limited to financial gain. Important clarification, distinction, just having financial interests or any other kind of interest in and of itself does not produce a conflict. Whether or not a conflict exists must be determined on a case-by-case basis, depending on what specific output we're talking about. And even more importantly, even where a conflict of interest is found, this does not mean that the researcher in question has acted unethically or committed any kind of research misconduct. As we can see from our definition, the existence of a conflict of interest poses a risk of potential bias, but that does not necessarily mean that a researcher is biased. The resulting risks still have to be managed. So here's an overview of what kind of conflicts of interest have. Very roughly, we distinguish between financial and non-financial conflicts. Financial conflicts can arise from employment, for example, but also from the receipt of payment for consulting, honoraria, royalties, patents, and so on. So things that were people working in scientific institutions or universities frequently come across. And non-financial conflicts relate to any professional or personal dependencies or ideological or political convictions that could influence somebody's judgment. Most COI policies, including Cochrane's own, focus primarily on financial interests, mostly since financial interests are somewhat easier to track and also to declare. We do, however, ask under both our policies that also non-financial conflicts should be declared. Now, why does conflict of interest matter? Because there is a long line of evidence from the past 25 years that shows that conflicts can and do have a statistically relevant, measurable effect on research findings. Here are some fairly recent examples from a large body of evidence that shows that industry funding can and does bias research results. The second one of these is actually a Cochrane review. And these studies show us clear evidence that studies evaluate products more favorably when the manufacturer is also the study sponsor. I'm showing these recent examples because, as our senior research integrity editor, Lisa Barrow, has told me, industry sometimes argues that while these problems may have existed in the past, these issues have now been resolved. But as these fairly recent examples from the past couple of years show, there is still an ongoing issue. And this in turn has a potential effect on trust in science. Trust in science is an extremely relevant factor for safeguarding democratic public discourse and especially in the biomedical field, public health. As we've all seen during the COVID-19 pandemic, the public not trusting scientific research can have serious and very large-scale effects. And that means that real or perceived researcher bias is an important factor in fostering trust, as perceptions of researcher bias, even in the absence of actual bias, can give rise to mistrust or even conspiracy narratives. These well-evidenced effects of industry funding on research findings that we've just seen could therefore potentially seriously jeopardize the willingness of the public to follow evidence-based recommendations. In Cochrane, this is, of course, especially important to us, and we take the subject of conflict of interest very seriously because Cochrane enjoys a very well-deserved reputation for high-quality information across many biomedical fields. High quality for us means based on the principles of independence, freedom from interference, assurance, and transparency. To uphold these principles, we need to make sure that we minimize the risks that conflicts of interest could have on the perception of trustworthiness of our research and our organization. Our most important research outputs are, of course, our systematic reviews. As most of you will be aware, systematic reviews use a set of standardized and replicable, reliable methods to evaluate and synthesize available evidence on a specific question. They underpin in the biomedical field a lot of evidence-informed decision-making at a very high level and frequently inform international and national healthcare guidelines and recommendations. So ensuring the trustworthiness of systematic reviews in this area is therefore extremely important. However, systematic reviews and especially Cochrane reviews also take a very long time to produce compared to standard scientific articles. So the median time, as you can see here, for a Cochrane review from protocol to the finished review is 2 years. And after publication of the reviews, many are periodically updated to incorporate new evidence, with the median time between updates coming up to 57 months, so almost 5 years. That means that becoming a Cochrane author and agreeing to comply with our conflict of interest policy is not a one-off action or a one-off decision. It can potentially mean a very long-term commitment. And we appreciate that this kind of long-term commitment can come with certain professional trade-offs. So across academic research, we are seeing a long-standing trend of diminishing public funding and various incentives for researchers to enter into collaboration with industry under various headings, pardon me, such as translation, engagement, impact, or knowledge valorization. In some institutions, these kinds of activities can also have an impact on hiring or promotion decisions, which can have a disproportionate effect on not yet established and junior researchers. So this means that on the one hand, avoiding industry funding is not always purely an individual decision, but at the same time, many authors do make this decision, and especially in the case of Cochrane authors, do so over a very extended period of time. I'm saying this mainly to underscore that Cochrane is aware of these trade-offs, and we do appreciate our authors making this kind of commitment. So when it comes to managing conflicts of interest at this stage, most scientific journals have some kind of mechanism for declaring interests. But what research shows is that few have a mechanism for enforcement for when a conflict is in fact detected. For Cochrane, that means that disclosure alone is not enough. Our conflict of interest policies also transparently state what happens if a person is found to be conflicted with some types of conflict, preventing people from authorship of a Cochrane review altogether. And this is why Cochrane's COI policy is and remains one of the most comprehensive and stringent in the industry. And in order to ensure that this remains the case, we have made championing research integrity an integral part of our scientific strategy, and we're constantly working to evolve our policies and processes to keep Cochrane reviews at the highest standards of trustworthiness that we have come to be known for. So let's take a look at the policies themselves, starting with the COI policy for Cochrane library content. Our current COI policy came into effect on October 14th, 2020, replaced the previous commercial sponsorship policy 2014, and it applies prospectively to anyone involved in producing content for the Cochrane library. It also applies to any content in our journal, Cochrane Evidence and Methods. Here is an overview of the most important points from the policy relating to authors. If you are a Cochrane author, you will be familiar with these. First, we're asking you to declare any interests from the past 3 years. Note, we're asking you to declare interests, not conflicts. This is because in some cases, authors may either innocently assume that an interest does not constitute a conflict when actually it does, or vice versa. They may assume that something excludes them from becoming a Cochrane author when that's not actually the case. So therefore, whether or not an interest does indeed constitute a conflict is decided by our editors and our research integrity team based on the author declarations that we receive. The policy also states that 2/3, so 67% of the author team should be conflict-free. This means that, for example, in an author team of 10, 2 authors could in fact have a conflict of interest, but the overall team would still be compliant with our policy. However, the first and last authors must be conflict-free in all cases, and there are also specific rules for authors who have been involved in producing a study that could be included in the review. These authors cannot make study eligibility decisions about, extract data from, carry out the risk of bias assessments for, or perform grade assessments of that particular study. Now, certain kinds of interests mean that you cannot be a Cochrane author at all, at least not for the topic that your interest relates to. These are current or past employment by a commercial or organization with a financial interest in the topic of the review, ownership of such an organization, or personal ownership of a patent for an intervention, diagnostic test, or prognostic marker that is relevant to the topic of the review. Now, this latter point does not apply to patents developed but not owned by individuals. And then there are some interests that may prevent authorship depending on the specific case, such as various kinds of payments from organizations with a financial interest, such as speaker fees, honoraria, consultancies, membership of advisory boards, payment for travel, legal testimony, and similar, the ownership of stocks and shares in healthcare-related companies, royalties for publications, and importantly, research funding and financial support for any professional academic activities. So what do we mean by financial interest related to the topic of the review? A commercial organization has such an interest when it produces or develops a substance, treatment, modality, device, or service that is a comparator in the review, and if found effective, the organization could stand to receive a financial benefit. So here is a completely made-up example to illustrate this. For example, an author declares travel support from Bayer 7 months before submitting a protocol titled acetyl salicylic acid, this is not my field, versus placebo for the treatment of headache. And Bayer, of course, is known for manufacturing aspirin, which includes exactly this substance. And therefore, should the review find that the substance is effective for the treatment of headaches, Bayer's sales of aspirin may go up. So in this case, we would therefore determine that the author has a conflict of interest for the purpose of this review, not necessarily for any other review. This would then be evaluated in the context of the rest of the author team as a conflicted author. Aside from authors, the COI policy for Cochrane Library content also covers editors and peer reviewers. For these groups, interests are declared and evaluated for the topic of the specific review that they handle or provide peer review for. Both groups also have to declare any relationship that they have with the authors of the review, and peer reviewers must complete a peer reviewer declaration of interest separately for every review that they do on a Cochrane review. Beyond that, the following groups are restricted from acting as editors or peer reviewers for Cochrane altogether. That's employees or owners of an organization with a financial interest in the topic of the specific Cochrane library content, so that specific review, for example, owners of relevant patents, and those with other financial interests in an intervention, diagnostic test, prognostic marker, or any other comparators considered in a specific review. So as I said at the start, we've recently made some updates to our COI policies. I'm emphasizing not to weaken, but to strengthen them. So we have not removed or weakened or softened any of the rules. The main changes here at a glance are we've overhauled the way we collect author declarations of interest to make that task easier to handle for authors. We're retiring the 2014 policy on the 1st of October. We've made some small tweaks to the policy itself to clarify wording that led to frequent requests for clarification. I'm going to show you which tweaks in a minute. And we are in the process of aligning our appeals process for COI decisions with the process for appeals against rejection in order to enable faster decisions on appeals for authors. So here are the tweaks that we've actually made to the wording of the policy. We have clarified that funding and payments for editors who make editorial decisions relate to the topic of the review. That's more interesting for editors. Then we've removed the reference to direct versus indirect funding, since that was frequently confusing for authors and led to questions as to what constitutes what. And we have therefore now clarified that payments count as relevant if and when an author has benefited from them, regardless of whether or not they were made to them personally or to their institution. So this acknowledges the fact that, for example, payments for research funding are very rarely made to an individual or into an individual bank account. They normally go to an institution, but they may benefit researchers in other ways, for example, when it comes to funding their lab, funding equipment, or when it comes to promotion decisions. Plus, we've also removed some outdated additional resources from the former Cochrane training webpage. And we're planning to update those pages with new training and learning resources very soon. So, up. As for the declarations of interest, we have spent the last year listening very carefully to our authors, who've been telling us for quite some time that the previous process of collecting these declarations using a third-party platform called Convey was quite difficult to use at times and could be quite frustrating. And therefore, we've now aligned our process with the process at other journals, so that authors now download a simple Microsoft Word declaration form from the Cochrane Library website. And the corresponding author should then collect these declarations from the entire author team and should submit them alongside the manuscript and ensure that it corresponds to the declaration section in Grohmann. The detailed instructions on how to do this are included in the form itself, and the items that we asked to declare on the form correspond exactly to the wording of the policy. The form itself is downloadable from the Cochrane Library website editorial policies page, where the COI policy itself is located. And if declarations are missing at manuscript submission from this change forward, the manuscript will count as incomplete, the submission will count as incomplete and may be returned to the authors. So that is probably the main change from the author side. And authors also no longer declare interests annually until the publication of their review, but only once at submission. And they make an explicit declaration on acceptance of the manuscript that either their interests have not changed, or if the interests have changed in the meantime, that the managing editor has been informed via the license to publish form. So, what does it mean for you as if you are an author? The Cochrane COI policy is now located in a different spot. So please update your bookmarks and Google results. It's now located on the Cochrane Library editorial policies page. The rules for authors have not changed, so you don't need to worry that anything about your COI status has changed on account of these policy updates. If you are a corresponding author, we are asking that, since you are now submitting the declaration of interest forms for the entire author team, that you make sure that the declarations are completed in due time for your prospective submission dates. And importantly, authors with manuscripts still under the 2014 policy, so that's manuscripts where the protocol was submitted before October 14th, 2020, should note that from the next update, the rules of the 2020 policy will apply to your manuscript. So if you believe or suspect that this could impact your COI status, please do contact us under this email address. The slides for this webinar will be shared afterwards, so you will have access to all the links. And now finally, a quick word about the COI policy for Cochrane staff and groups. Part of our updates was also to create a clearer distinction between our two COI policy and clarify exactly who the COI policy for groups applies to. So it applies to Cochrane employees, any staff in Cochrane groups or units, to the governing board, the editorial board, and any other Cochrane staff or affiliate categories. So individuals in these categories strictly cannot be employed by a pharmaceutical or medical devices company, and they must declare any financial interests annually. For the governing board, this means any interests from the past 10 years, and for all other groups, it means in the past 36 months. What do they have to declare? Members of the governing board declare any financial interest in the work of Cochrane whatsoever. Core volunteer roles or staff of Cochrane groups or units must declare any financial interest in the broad topic area of their group or unit. Members of the editorial board declare any financial interest in Cochrane library content or production, and core volunteer roles or staff of other Cochrane affiliate categories declare any financial interest relating to commercial organizations involved in healthcare or medical research. So you can see different categories of individuals here have different timescales and different scopes as to what interests have to be declared. So this aligns our policy with for those who declare interest annually via their Cochrane membership, and all declarations of interest that are under this policy are publicly available on cochrane.org. Here's a screenshot of what that looks like, so you can search for any Cochrane staff member and look at their declaration on our website. There is also an internal follow-up process in cases when interest may breach our COI policy. And you can read the COI policy for Cochrane groups itself in full at the below link. So that was a quick overview from me. I'm now going to give back to Dario, who I think has been collecting questions in the chat. And of course, if you have any questions to add, then please do so.
Thanks. So I've shared the links to the policies in the chat. We haven't received any questions yet, but I might start perhaps. Perhaps it was, your presentation was very clear, and I also assume that the policies, Cochrane policies themselves, are also clear. So that might explain why there are not so many questions. But I'm personally curious. I mean, you've mentioned that a study showed that only less than 2% of journals, did I get it right, had mechanisms to enforce their conflict of interest policies. Did I get that right? So
Yes.
what would actually be, what would those mechanisms be? I mean, is it the declaration of interests like you've mentioned or described? Is that, or is it something else? And what Cochrane does, to be within that less than, or within that group which does have some mechanisms to enforce conflict of interest policy.
Yeah. No, so these mechanisms refer simply to consequences. So if something is declared that could constitute a conflict, then our process in Cochrane is that either a managing editor looks at this interest and determines whether or not this constitutes a conflict in the context of that particular review, or it comes to the research integrity team, to myself and our senior research integrity editor, and we determine that. And if it turns out that an author or an author team is in breach of our COI policy, then that can mean that a review will be rejected. Of course, that's very sad every time it happens, because authors put a lot of work into these reviews, and as we've seen, they take a very long time to produce. And so it does not make us happy if we have to reject a review on COI grounds. But in the interest of trustworthiness and transparency, sometimes, unfortunately, it's necessary.
Okay, so Ella asks, what types of areas are most common for breaches of the conflict of interest policy for the Cochrane Library content?
So one thing we're seeing quite frequently is consulting. On the one hand, because consulting is a very broad umbrella category for all kinds of activities that researchers can do in this space. Followed by various other payments for academic activities. So during my tenure at Cochrane, we haven't had an author who was, for example, employed by a pharmaceutical company, but we do quite often see academic researchers working in universities who've received research funding or any other kind of payments from commercial organizations. I think consultancy, we recently did a little bit of research on our conflict of interest support tickets, and consultancy was the biggest category of cases that we've looked at.
Okay, thanks. Elena has pointed out that there's one old quick guide is still available, so we'll take care of that to make sure that that's not visible. Obviously, with any, but it also to note that this update to those websites of the COI policies coincided with the overall migration of Cochrane training website to the new Cochrane org. So there may be that some old pages are still, but thanks for pointing this out. And we'll try to sort it out as soon as possible. So we have another question. Assume a manuscript has been submitted for consideration by a 5-author team, and one member is conflicted. Upon acceptance of the manuscript, one other author becomes conflicted, say following employment by a digital health company owned by a pharma company. So what happens when an author becomes conflicted after the acceptance of the manuscript, and then it kind of goes over the threshold of 66% or less than 66% conflicted authors?
And that author team would have to consider that at the next update if they're planning one.
So it wouldn't affect that
No,
publication,
it would
initial
not affect
publication.
that review. Like we do not monitor if our authors acquire conflicts after the publication of their review. But if they are planning to update, then that update will require another set of declarations.
Okay. So we don't have any more questions from the audience here. So okay, we have Maria Inti has raised hand. So Ollie, can you unmute Maria Inti?
Hello, thank you. So I was wondering, with regard to the commercial organization, two specific questions. How would you consider the involvement in a commercial organization that offers digital health products, but those are for a disease that is different from the disease that you're tackling in a review? So basically, it's digital health interventions, but for a different disease. Would that be a conflict of interest? That's my first question. And my second question is, expanding on what you just said on consultancy, it happens a lot that methodologists get asked to do small tasks for money for companies that help producing systematic reviews. So they are, I would say, a commercial organization, but they don't have direct financial interests in a specific product, for example.
Yeah, thank you for these great questions. So for the first one, in general, we consider digital health products in exactly the same way as any other health products, whether that's medication and intervention or anything else. And as such as for any other product, it would depend on whether or not it's relevant to the topic of the review. So in a simplified way of speaking, you could say we look at would this commercial organization potentially financially benefit if this review found the intervention, the medication, etc., to be effective? And if the answer to that question is yes, then there is a potential conflict, whether that's a digital or any other kind of product. And the second question, as for methodological conflicts, that's an interesting one, but we would very likely look at that under the same kind of criteria. Is there anything about this person's interests that mean that a commercial entity that they have an interest with could benefit from a particular outcome or finding of that review? And that would be the guiding question for us to evaluate that. But generally speaking, we don't have any prohibitions against doing this kind of methods work, including in commercial contexts.
Okay, thanks, Maria Inti, for a question. And there was just, I would say, clarification or additional question, or about the question that we had previously about this scenario with 5 author team and one of them becoming conflicted after. So basically the comment was there would not be issue here if the review was published, but it would be an issue if it had been accepted but not yet published.
Yes.
That's the case, right? So okay.